Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Mighty Blaze, Poets in Conversation for this month, May 2022. We talked a bit about whether or not to run today's program in light of recent events and decided to move forward as a measure of connection and hope with each other. So thank you both to Mary Jo and to Richie for joining us today. And thanks to everybody who's taking time out of their schedule in order to talk about poetry. I'm very excited. This is such a bright spot in a hard month, in a hard time. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. This is going to be fun.
Thank you, Allison, and I'm so happy to see you, Mary Jo.
Likewise.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you both. And first of all, before we get started, I do want to start on another bright spot, which is by saying happy birthday to Richie. Talk about dedication, coming to do work on your birthday. Happy birthday to you, Richie.
I can't think of a better birthday party. I've been mostly trapped indoors, so this is the highlight of the month.
Great.
Well, it will be for me too, I'm sure. But I want to give just a bit of background on both of you and your work for the people who are listening. First of all, Mary Jo Salter. Welcome, Mary Jo. I also have to just say a quick note that when I reached out to Mary Jo about being on the program, I said, well, there's a few poets I've been reading recently who I feel like have some sort of connection to your work, and who was first on the list but Richie Hoffmann, not knowing, of course, that you had worked together. And she said, oh, Richie is one of my former students. So I think there's some sort of threads going between your work that it's evidence, even to someone who didn't know you've been working together. So welcome as friends as well as colleagues.
Thank you.
Mary Jo Salter lives in Baltimore, where she's Krieger Eisenhower Professor in the Writing Seminars at Johns Hopkins. She's the author of 8 previous poetry collections, including The Surveyors, Nothing by Design, and the new and selected A Phone Call to the Future, as well as a children's book, The Moon Comes Home. Mary Jo is also co-editor of the Norton Anthology of Poetry, which I'm going to ask about later, too, because I'm very curious about it, as well as a playwright and lyricist. About Zoom Rooms, Mary Jo's most recent collection, right here, Zoom Rooms. The wonderful Maya Popa says, Salter captures how our experiences of beauty aren't quite articulable and implicitly challenge our understanding of time's passing. The affecting final poem asks, how could such floods of love not add up to enough? How indeed, she says. So welcome, Mary Jo. Richie Hoffmann, who actually, it turns out, we crossed paths years ago too when you were an undergrad at BU. So this is a pleasure.
That's right. I know everyone somehow.
It's like 6 degrees of Richie Hoffmann. Richie Hoffmann is the author of a new collection, 100 Lovers, right here, as well as the debut Second Empire, which was Alice James, if memory serves. His poetry has appeared recently in the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and the Yale Review. Richie teaches at Stanford, where he was previously a Stegner Fellow, if I'm not mistaken, and lives between Chicago and San Francisco. Jericho Brown calls 100 Lovers, quote, a book of love poems that consciously and subversively harken back to Shakespeare's sonnets, marking Hoffmann's position as one of our necessary poets of erotic desire. And it is a hot HAWT book, I would agree. These short lyrics come together in their discussion of geography, painting, sculpture, and classical music, as if to say that love, that queer love, is indeed as immortal as a poem, which is a beautiful tribute, I think, to the book. So welcome again to both of you. I wanted to start today with a question about form, and a question specifically, I mean, I'm going to get into more abstract questions about Artifice, but I wanted to ask about rhyme and some of the really, really identifiable elements of form. So I'll start with a specific example from you, Mary Jo. In many of your poems, you use not only rhyme, but a kind of bookending rhyme. So either like an ABBA or like an ABA type of thing, where the rhyme really kind of finishes off a movement. So an example would be, if anyone's following along in your session has timed out, the opening poem. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your choice of using rhyme either internally or in a way that subverts and stirs up even as it settles, if that makes sense.
Yes, sure. I think, I mean, rhyme is just something that's always pleased me in the poets I love, and it's so much part of what I've been hearing inside my head for so many years that it's an actual choice not to be rhyming. And my more conversational poems tend not to rhyme, but they can also rhyme. I think one of the things that makes rhyme interesting is both the expected and the unexpected. And Richie has surely in a class heard me quote Robert Graves, who said, rhymes should be like gifts at Christmas. You know you're going to get one, but you don't know what you're going to get. And so it's not only that they may be, that, I mean, it's pleasing because it's expected. On the other hand, it's unexpected. And then there's this other element that it interests me, which is the pleasure of writing within a rhyme scheme has changed for me, and it is often writing outside of a rhyme scheme. So, for example, if I'm writing a sonnet, I might choose any rhyme scheme at all as long as everything rhymes. Or in this, our session has timed out. The one you mentioned, it's written in tercets, and in general. You know, you would want, if it's 3 lines, that you would want one rhyme and one thing that's free. And that's one of the pleasures of tercets. I could go on, but I'll stop there. That's a beginning of an answer.
Though I'm sure we would love to hear more. But what about you, Richie? I mean, there's so much rich music play in yours too.
Well, I love writing poems that rhyme. I'm mostly interested in the rhyming couplet. It feels like a kind of wandering. I love Mary Jo bringing up the Robert Graves quote, because I feel like when I'm writing in rhyme, the gift is also to me, the poet. Yes. Rhyme is always leading me to somewhere new. James Merrill calls form a divining rod for content, and I think the rhyming couplet is like one of the most dramatic examples of that, because it's kind of leading you to secret sources. So I always feel when I'm writing a poem with those progressive rhymes, it's kind of pulling me forward through the poem, limiting my options line after line, yes, bringing me to new territories. That's kind of the most exciting element for me as a writer.
You know, when you were saying that about rhyming couplets, I was thinking of the last poem in your book, 100 Lovers, Feast of Days, which is in rhyming couplets, but you're choosing not to write in a regular meter. And so that adds another kind of surprise. We know we're always going to get an AA rhyme, but we don't know when it's going to come. And one of the things I love about that poem is that if you think about some of the other writers who have done that, there are people like Ogden Nash, who is hysterically funny, but it almost would seem as if you'd have to be funny to do that. And in that poem, I mean, it's charming, but it's not funny. It's dead serious. So that's another way I think you have freed yourself while working a rhyme, and it's a good strategy.
I think Schmackenberg is someone
yes,
doing this in early work that I know we both love her poems very much.
Yes.
You know, Mary Jo, that poem specific, I was thinking about that poem. I think it's the oldest poem in this book that I wrote. And I think I remember sitting with you in the atrium at Hopkins 10 years ago. I think that's a poem we worked on together.
I don't want to take any credit, but I think it is. I remember. Yes, I certainly remember it from long ago, but I'm sure you've also made quite a few changes too. You know.
Oh, that's right. But I remember bringing that poem to you, so it's got a special kind of private history for me.
It's nice to hear.
Well, both of you do play with rhyme too. I mean, we're talking about rhyme. I mean, we're talking about rhyme using a single word, but there's such a spectrum of rhymes in both books, and slant rhymes are such a huge expressive part. I had one marked down, Mary Jo, that I don't have right at my hands from yours, but since you brought up Richie's final poem, I've pulled it up here. And if you notice, the beginning of the poem starts with pretty exact rhymes: odd and showed, Nespa, Vespa, gleam.
That's my favorite.
I love that one.
I can't believe I got away with that.
I think it's delightful. But then it begins to become blurrier in a really expressive way, sometimes in names, and then conversation in Boston. And I feel like it has that sort of stretchy, blurry quality at the end that moves it back into the kind of mumble of the everyday beyond artifice, you know?
Yeah.
Is that something that you think about, like deploying slant rhymes, or is it just a kind of instinctive thing?
Do you want to answer that, Richie? I mean,
Well, I guess it's something you're feeling out as the poem's kind of moving. I remember thinking this poem was about breaking up. I was really anxious. I was going to be going through a breakup. I remember bringing this poem to you, Mary Jo, and I was convinced that that's what it was about. And I remember you said something, I think you said something like, one of the things I am most interested in the poem is that the couple is so sure that they're going to be together forever. And I remember being kind of, shocked by this kind of opposite reading that I had of the poem. But I guess in a poem like this, I was thinking about coming together and moving apart, things that feel close, things that feel intimate, and things that are stretching, a kind of beginning of a distance. I don't know how consciously I was thinking of that, line by line, but I guess post facto, it's kind of how I'm thinking about the poem now.
yeah, and I think, modern poetry, by holding on to rhyme, but sort of redefining it in English. I mean, because English is so, first of all, so unphonetic, and secondly, we don't have a predictable stress at the end of a word. It could be either. And, I don't want to embarrass you by continuing to talk about how great you are, but I was rereading this poem, and if the last two lines, the last sentence is also a rhyme. If we reach the tower, the scrap of paper says, we've gone too far. That sounds completely conversational, but if we think about it, tower, the stress is on tau, and too far, the stress is on far. So it's an off rhyme, and it's also a light rhyme, meaning, that it's stress and unstress are rhyming. And I think that's something that I love about Marianne Moore in particular. She just really taught me to hear rhymes differently and just kind of open up for that kind of moment that Richie has there.
Well, I have some questions about fixed form, but I want to move more broadly to a question about artifice and poetic beauty, and consciousness of poetic beauty. So in both of your work, there's a consciousness, and there's often a kind of thematized discussion of artifice and looking at looking, or being aware of looking. And so I wondered about the relationship between that. I always wonder in my own work too, about the relationship between that and truth-telling. I think it's artificial, of course, to say these two things are at odds, and in fact, they're in conversation with each other. But I don't know, sometimes I find myself saying, oh, a moment of plain speech is what's called for. And then other times I say, my number one job is to give an experience of beauty or connection to the reader. So I was just wondering, I have a line, Mary Jo, from your poem, Carlo, Crevelli and the Trees, that I thought actually provoked this question. What excuse then for the lustrous finish on the instrument of torture set before that sparse landscape? So what excuse then for the lustrous finish on the instrument of torture set before that sparse landscape? So again, I wanted to ask about the relationship between the lull and the truth of poetic beauty relative to the heaviness, weight, and precision of truth-telling. So maybe, Mary Jo, we could turn to you first on that.
We were talking about maybe reading a poem or two. Could I read that poem, and then that way I think I could say a little bit more about it. Let's see. Okay, so this poem,
page eight for anyone following along. Page 8.
Page 7 starts on. You were talking about the Carlo Crevelli poem, yeah. Just one little thing about this. I saw this painting in Milan in the Pinacoteca there, and they actually have several Carlo Crevelli paintings in the same room. And one of them, which was part 2 of this poem for a long time before I decided that it was distracting and I just threw it away, was actually where you could see the wood that the painter had painted on, and because it had been damaged in a fire. And but that led me to thinking about this painting, which is about a crucifixion. And so the crucifixion takes place on a cross of wood. But in Crevelli's case, before most painters were painting on canvas, he's painting on wood. So he's painting on wood, something that's made of wood, and he's trying to make it look a lot like wood. Okay, Carlo Crevelli and the trees. Playful, prolific, noted for tableau of beauty, he'd do a portrait of a man's face composed of fruit, or picture his Madonnas under garlands bright as chandeliers, of nearly 3D pickles, pears, apples pecked by birds, then turn even a gruesome crucifixion into a sort of game. Here, a trompe-l'oeil in oil and tempera replicates the look of wood on a panel that is truly wooden. In fact, paints over knots to make knots in the hard planes of the cross. Real as a relic, the unique tree on which one man-god dies, while mourners on both sides gaze up, their tresses patterned like wood grain again, the dry eyes in their deep-lined faces weeping beads of sap. And in that surfacing of sorrow, each arrested teardrop tough as an acorn, as if there to sow millennia of grief. What excuse then for the lustrous finish on the instrument of torture set before that sparse landscape? What could be meant by the assorted grayish, spindly background saplings, barely a leaf, though it is spring, alive? Should we write off existence simply as a pale prequel to the tale of afterlife? False question for him, probably, inclined to honor foremost his material, which is to say the fresh-cut trees splintered into delicate paintbrushes, or hewn as flat, massive planks to soak up these minerals and plants ground down to the consistency of paints that may or may not blossom in the ways the maker wants. You were talking, Allison, about plain speech, and I think one way I've tried to address my own need for that is that certain poems like this, in which I'm talking about an artist's artifice, I am going to be very artificial. I'm going to have lots of internal rhymes, lots of puns. I think the one I was happiest with was trompe-l'oeil, which has a lot of the same letters as oil and tempera. You know, I had fun with it because I did, and also because I was paying tribute to his, in some sense, having fun with it. But he's painting a crucifixion, and so that's the pull, is that how do we? It's not just how can poetry give us pleasure in a world full of pain, but how can the poet take pleasure in writing about a world full of pain? And you just get into it. But I think there is also pleasure in feeling in other kinds of poems that you've replicated what it's like to think aloud or what it's like to talk to a friend. And you've shaped it, of course, but you've given the reader the illusion that what you've done is something that's almost like just thinking aloud.
Thank you so much, Richie. It occurs to me that the history of pleasure makes its own, I don't know that I would call it an argument, but in the history of pleasure, there's also a way in which artifice and traditions of art and marble rub up against, you know, the natural, the accidental. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I was thinking as Mary Jo was reading that poem, just that so often beauty and gruesomeness coexist, that pleasure exists alongside ugliness, that violence and luxury are often fellow travelers, that, you know, there's a way that I think both of our poems navigate that. Even a gruesome crucifixion, right, can be beautiful. And I think I'm also interested in the inverse of this too, that sometimes the most luxurious things are also ugly or have a kind of dark underside in the poem. and in the world.
Don't you have in one of your poems, Richie, I can't call it up immediately, but a woman walking a dog that is an ugly, beautiful dog?
Yeah, that's right.
There you
We've
go.
all seen these kinds of creatures, right? Ugly, beautiful.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of interested in the coexistence of those.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you would read maybe The History of Pleasure for us.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Page 19.
Thank you. History of Pleasure. I walked by myself to the market, past ruins with broken bodies of stone, where even a fragment of a man could undo me. I bought herbs wrapped in paper. Light shone through the glass of our apartment. You had been showering. The smell of mint invaded the room. Your hair was wet.
I love that final line.
I do too.
It's just so, I feel like it takes a lot of confidence to have a poem that's brief and doesn't sort of try to explain itself. And there are so many like that in here that are photographs, but rich photographs somehow. So I love that one. I feel like I want to.
And, not just photographs, but, one of the things I love about this poem, and a number of them in this book, is you've got other senses, and here, the aroma, the smell is so important. And I love the fact that you've got also herbs wrapped in paper, and you've got someone walking out of a shower smelling of mint. But is it the mint in the shampoo? Is it the mint that's wrapped up in the paper? Everything is sort of suffused, and that paper is sort of the poem too. And but as Allison says, you just don't overdo it.
Yeah, I don't know. More and more I'm looking for sensuous moments in the world and in poems, to make them feel present, to make them feel alive. I've been thinking about your question about plain speech. I think a lot of my sentences are really simple. I think that's something I'm trying to work on, to make a poetry out of really simple sentences. But I also don't think they often sound like speech. I think it'd be very weird if people spoke like this. They often, I don't know, I kind of like them to have a bit of an alien feeling. And I think like in the craft process, like that often comes from kind of carving the poem down. This poem has a sculpture in it, a fragmentary man body in it, but I feel like often when I'm drafting a poem, it's much longer, and then the process of revision is kind of cutting it down or trying to create some feeling out of what's subtracted. I think that maybe gives it some of, it's a plain quality, but also maybe a bit alien or strange at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
if that makes sense.
I wonder if some of that has to do with poetry's special sense of time. If you'll forgive me, like a slight on-ramp to this question. I was teaching, I think I'm the last person in America to teach the book On the Road, but I was teaching on the road this semester, and for various reasons. Not all celebratory, but there's a great moment when the main character in the fictional version, Sal Paradise, talks about how he and his compatriots were in Texas, I believe it was, and they wander into a house that is attached to a small market at a gas station, and they steal some things, and they can hear that the family is just beyond in the next room having dinner. And Sal sort of takes the necessities and Dean takes the supplements, I guess you could say, the supplementary materials. But there's this quick moment when in his past tense narrative, Sal then says, "Crooks don't know," as a present tense reflection of the narrator. And I was thinking about this, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, how in first person narration, there's often this concurrent sense of existing in a very visceral, sensory way in the present, but also inhabiting the past. or like very much being alive in a memory and a reflection. I felt this very strongly in both of your books. And I wrote down, Mary Jo, in yours, Oriquiete and Triangle, for example, Eternity Travels, Richie, in all of the poems that I mentioned for you to read today. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the time of poetry and how it maybe differs for you from the time of like a play or the time of a short story or something like that. How does poetry create its own time?
Yeah, I mean, I once, in one of my books, I have a section called Timepieces. And originally I wanted to call the book that, and I think somebody else had already thought of it. So I just made it a section. But it seems to me that pun addresses some of this, is that, you know, it's like a watch. It like tells you how much time has passed, in the sense that poems are often either nostalgic or anticipatory or both, but also they tell you how much time has passed because you can see with a lyric anyway, as opposed to, you know, if you're reading the Divine Comedy or something. But if you're reading a lyric, you have a sense of how long that poem is before you ever read a word. And so you recognize what kind of time is the minimum you need. Sorry that there are people picking up trash at this very moment, which is why I was trying to mute but anyway, I hope you can't hear it. And so, you know, time also is, because poems end soon, they are reinforcing the idea that life ends soon. It's never enough. And it's one of the reasons why the kind of sensory details that Richie's talking about are so important, because that's all we've got, is we've just got our experience now to serve as some kind of counterweight to everything that's about time being short in a poem.
I'm thinking too, Mary Jo, about this tension in lyric poetry of the Horatian monument, this idea that this is something more lasting than stone, that has a kind of eternal dimension, at least the fiction of an eternal dimension at its heart. And yet we also think of poems as a kind of single moment, distilled, expanded, inhabited, explored, made sensuous, made alive. I feel like I'm always thinking about the tension between those things, that there's a way that the poem is kind of exists outside of time and for all time, but very often its emotions or its ideas are so fixed to something really local, to one sense experience, to one emotional flood, to one short instance of a narrative, and both are always animated in every poem.
You know, I can't imagine anybody today saying that their poem that their poems would outlast monuments. I mean, Shakespeare got to say it because it turned out to be true, but he didn't know that when he wrote it.
That's right. I think the impulse must be there somehow.
Right.
The desire to write anything down.
Yes.
In these forms that are older than us, and that we
yes.
inhabit kind of as visitors, hoping to stay for forever.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, a related question, of course. Both of you are known for writing ekphrasis, for writing ekphrastic poems, and that's something I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to kind of combine two questions, and I'm spinning a little bit, Richie, off of Mummified Bird, and Mary Jo with your Saint Sebastian interceding for the plague-stricken, among many others. You both have many ekphrastic poems. And I wanted to ask a little bit what ekphrastic poetry offers you as a poet, you know, in terms of engaging and connecting. And then I wanted to connect that to another question, which relates to, again, I could use Mummified Bird again with you, Richie, Mary Jo with your Silk Blouse. I was thinking about both of your poems as a kind of still life painting at times. And so I just wanted to put that out there, a question of what the value is or what the interest is for you of ekphrastic poetry, but then also how your poems, if they are at all, how they might be like still life paintings.
Yeah, sure. I love the arts deeply. I mean, it's how I want to live my life. It's not, I think poems about paintings and music, they don't just offer a kind of interesting craft question. That's just how I want to live. At the most basic level, I kind of want to be surrounded by that. I think artistically, other arts always get me thinking about form more deeply, thinking about other ways in to things, how other artists have seen the world and made it visible. I'm always looking, you don't want to just recreate a kind of work, you want to do something to it. I love John Hollander's notion of an ekphrastic agenda from this marvelous book, The Gazer's Spirit, which is one of my favorite books coming up, but it's now out of print. I can't teach, it's like $80 or something and impossible to find. So one of my dreams one day, maybe with Mary Jo, would be to do a new teaching text for ekphrastic poetry.
Let's do it, Richie. That's a great idea.
There's nothing like that really that could quite replicate that book, and I'd love to redo it. It needs a bit of an update, and I think you and I are just the people to do it.
Mark Doty has a book called Still Life With, and I'm forgetting what it is with, but
Oysters and Lemons.
That's right, Oysters and Lemons, and that's a prose book talking about his obsession. It begins with his obsession with one still life painting, and it ends up sort of incorporating everything in his life. And it's very poetic prose. I very much like that book. I agree with you, Richie. I think it's part of the ekphrastic impulse is we live in art. This is what we want to do. And so even though it's really hard for us to write poems, we have some data point that we can sometimes kind of do it. Whereas I can't, I'm not a painter, I'm not a composer, and so there is a feeling of wonder about the accomplishment of what one has seen and of a desire to pay homage in some sense. And there's also, I think there are ekphrastic poems that are definitely about a particular painting or sculpture, and there are others, and I think of yours in particular, Richie. You often, will have a scene in which there is a painting or a museum, but you are not necessarily, like you have the one about medieval painting in which you don't actually name any painters, and I think that is very much one of the things that I got out of Hollander. He distinguishes between actual ekphrasis, where you're actually describing a thing you're looking at, and notional ekphrasis, which is like, we don't have the shield of Achilles, let's write about it anyway, and they're both exciting to do. But yes, I think you're right, Allison, they are like still lives, and yet you've got to animate that seemingly dead thing in a way that's different from the painter, or you've just done a kind of book report.
Yeah, I feel like still life, objects, they hold emotions and ideas in the world. I mean, even something like orecchiette pasta, like there's an idea that lives inside of that pasta shape that Mary Jo's poetry makes alive for us, right? There are objects kind of contain all of this emotional information, and I think poems are one space to kind of bring that out. I feel like often it's objects that seem to carry all of the feeling. I think about Claudia Emerson, a poet I adore. In her book Late Wife, she has this great poem Artifice, in which she's describing the lasting effects of her husband's dead wife, and she sees the hair still in the brush.
Yeah.
And that line, it always gives me such chills, and it really, I think in a lot of ways teaches me what a poetic image is, which is not just a random piece of description, but something described that has all of the feeling, all of the ideology, all of the intellectual work of any poem kind of right in that one detail. I'm always looking for that kind of thing when I'm writing and when I'm reading.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about an essay by Kathy Park Hong that was published years ago in Poetry Magazine called Against Witness. And the title sounds pretty ferocious, and the essay is a little ferocious too. It raises some really interesting questions about the notion of poetry of witness. One of the things that Kathy mentions is she details the name of the artist now, but there's a Colombian artist that she details who uses, in order to reflect the experiences of the disappeared, she creates eroded and worn household and domestic objects to be on display, ones that defy representation, like online. You have to be there to feel the uncanny, hauntedness of the objects, and the fact that these are lived in, these are worn. Someone opened this drawer and put silverware in, and now that silverware is gone. And that's sort of what I mean by the idea of a still life, which I think we could look at it, or even a sculpture. We could look at it like a torso or some marble torso and say, oh, it's just a dead object, or it's a residual of like an encounter or something. But on the contrary, it seems like both of you approach these things as like constellations of experience that you're then, entering conversation with, which I find really remarkable and rich as a reader. So maybe we could turn to another poem so that we're not just talking about your poems, but Richie, I have Opulence open because I was thinking in some ways this poem speaks to some of what we're talking about. Maybe we could turn to that next. And let me remind people too, I see that there are some questions in the comments area, but we'll turn in a few minutes to Q&A. So if people have questions for our illustrious guests, please post them now.
Well, this is a dark poem, I think. It speaks a bit to what I was talking about earlier with kind of luxury and decay coexisting, cohabiting in this kind of dark little autobiography. It's called Opulence. The night river calms me with its slow, dirty movements. I walk home briskly in a black baseball cap. I work at the fringes of the day. I write poetry in bed and criticism in the bath. Among my friends here, I have a man who calls me love names in 4 languages. Once, in a moment, I thought I wanted to die of his pleasure. But that was a wound speaking. The history of this place abounds with wounds. Mobs of vandals have ransacked the villas. A very rich man on his deathbed, from a corrupt family who loves the arts, was fed a medicine of powdered pearls.
I can't hear. I can't hear you. Can you hear Richie?
You married not Allison. No worries.
Hi, everybody. I
Hello.
think that Allie's going to log off and come back on. I'm Julie Gerstenblatt. I'm just here to produce and fan.
Hi,
And what I
Julie.
think, hi, Richie. Hi, Mary Jo. What I think we should do now is just let the two of you have a conversation. And it looks like Allie's coming right back.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, thank goodness. I'm so sorry.
I was convinced it was my computer.
That's a first. All of a sudden, my computer just went black and shut down. So
Yeah.
that
I
was
read
me.
the poem Opulence.
Yes, good. I'm sorry I missed it, but I have.
It was
read
a
it
really
several
good
times.
reading.
Well, I'll go back and rewatch it. Luckily, it's recorded. Let me pass it maybe to you, Mary Jo. We had
Sure.
talked about you potentially reading the Saint Sebastian poem, if you would. This time, I'll try not to disappear, and then I'll have a question on the other side.
Can I just say, because my poems have been longer than Richie's, that I'm very happy to read something shorter or to hear Richie say more. But that Opulence poem, I just want to say, I don't generally have epigraphs to my books, but it did occur to me that I write poetry in bed and criticism in the bath would make a fabulous epigraph to a book of anything, really, a novel, poetry, criticism. It's hilarious. And what I love about it is that it's a very serious poem. And it's ending with this man on his deathbed. I mean, you've got bed in there twice, the writer writing poetry in bed, and then you end with a man on his deathbed being fed a medicine of powdered pearls. I don't know how you did that, Richie, but I think partly what you were saying is that you do it by subtraction, that you probably, am I right, you had a longer version of this?
I think that's right. And then delete some of the feeling, and what's left feels chillier or more uncanny, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it's really wonderful.
I love the idea of this as an epigraph. I mean,
I may have to steal it.
I lived it, Mary Jo, and now someone else can be inspired. But
I had marked that same line, and I thought there's something languid and tense about it at the same time, you know. So I really love that.
And not to be too I don't know, too logical about it. But when you say that you write criticism in the bath, it does suggest to me that it is a sullying experience to read criticism, and you need to be in the bath. You know, it is purer to read or write criticism in the bath. Anyway, well, should I read this long poem? I'm happy to read a shorter one. Do we have time?
Please do. Please read it. What do you think, Richie?
Right.
It's your birthday.
Yes, please. I would love to hear it.
What I'll say about this poem, which is called Saint Sebastian Interceding for the Plague-Stricken, is that it's in the Baltimore Museum of Art. I live in Baltimore. I've seen it many times. I think I first took a picture of it, had it in my phone 7 or 8 years ago. And every time I go back, I think I must write a poem about that. And then the pandemic happened, and suddenly I felt I had a little door in, and it was a way of writing about a plague without alluding in any way to the ones that we are just, I hope, coming out of. And the painting is by someone whose name I cannot pronounce, Jose Lieferinckse, about 1499. At the arch of the city gate, 2 rolling wheels are caught in one halted moment. The back half of a horse harnessed to the front of a cart that serves as hearse for a pile of swaddled corpses. What crops their little scene is more city pressing in. Castellated turrets, fortifications, courtyards, churches with a recurrence of steeples like arrowheads, stuck in the pint-sized saint who prays but feels no pain. Loinclothed Sebastian kneels on a tatty patch of surus, while brown-bearded, red-cloaked, hardy Jesus on heaps of cumulus lifts a hand in blessing. White is for the one-robed angel billowing below him like more clouds. White is for the Cossacks on the tonsured monks performing obsequies over earthbound bodies. White is for the shrouds on the dead set down in streets that once held milling crowds. Shrouds tight as bandages, each one a chrysalis that hoped to be undone, awaken, fly in bliss up to eternity, although the sky contends with the angels opposite, a beaked, bat-like, web-footed, winged demon of some sort, who wields above its head an object that's a cross between cross and battle axe. Some sicken behind doors, but one foregrounded man hired to slip another's body into a body-shaped, expectant hollow, a grave like a man's shadow, is pictured in the instant he himself is stricken, arms raised in agony as a woman raises hers in lament. His sleeves are green, the only green, and large as life, larger than anything which floating, tiny Sebastian has time to say.
Just, it's so gorgeous, Mary Jo, and it relates to that project Allison was talking about of kind of collapsing time, something from the 15th century feeling so immediate, and so attendant to what we were experiencing.
If people don't know the painting, which I did not, at least I looked it up, and though the poem gives it its own life and vision, look it up, because I think I don't think I would have noticed how the man who is not a grave digger necessarily, but someone who is there to sort of lay the body in the grave, as the poem says, how he is suddenly overcome. And so there's the moment of being so absorbed in his own action that he doesn't realize that his own time universe, is continuing on without his control. It's just I just thought it was such a beautiful poem. It actually reminded me of Heather McHugh's What He Thought, because do you know that poem about Giordano Bruno? Do you guys know that poem?
I can't call it up immediately. I admire her very much, though, so I'm going to have to go back and look.
It's such a good one. It's a long narrative poem about a group of poets and artists being in Italy, and being kind of glib is one of the words that she uses, her speaker uses. And then at the end, a quiet guide who's been taking them around the city gives them a definition of poetry relating to Giordano Bruno. But there's a sense of that sometimes we can be so caught up in a central action or a central scene that we miss some of the broader scene around it. It sounds dumb when I say it that way, but when Heather McHugh writes a poem about it, it sounds great. But well, let's see. We have some questions here, so I want to turn to them. And we have a great one from Margaret Pinard, who is a writer and someone who's associated with the Mighty Blaze. So welcome, Margaret. Margaret asks, and there's a little follow-up to this, how would you describe your personal feeling toward a poem you wrote long ago versus one that came to be just recently? Do they evolve? And then she follows up to say, do your feelings evolve specifically? So not just do the poems evolve, but do your feelings evolve? What do you think, Richie, since we started by talking about how your final poem is maybe the oldest poem, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I mean, I just remember being very early on when I was just starting to write poems and writing my first book, having dinner with a poet who was putting together his selected poems. And these poems to me felt so hot and urgent. They were all I could think about. And he was saying that there was not a single poem from his first or second or maybe third book that he saw fit to reprint. And I thought that was so kind of jarring to think that what feels so immediate to me now might one day be really embarrassing or at the very least unrecognizable. I don't feel like I have that experience yet. But I think my feelings are always evolving about the poems. I don't know. I feel like I'm in a period where I want to grow and change all of the time. When I read something new, there's no better feeling. And sometimes this happens in a workshop where, you'll learn something about poetry, not just about your poem at hand, but about poetry. And you realize you have to go home and burn everything you've ever written that you've in fact never written a poem until now, or the next poem. You've been doing it wrong. I'm still very tantalized by that feeling. There are certain things that persist. Feast days, I feel fondly about, even though it's 10 years old, but I don't think I could write it today. What I care about is kind of moved, and the kinds of music that I'm hearing and thinking through in poetry has changed. So I do think it's evolving, but you have to be a little bit gentle with the pieces you made. I think they deserve it, but that doesn't mean they could be replicated exactly as they are today, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, it raises the question of revision, and there are great writers who've gone back and revised substantially, like Yeats and Auden, and who am I to tell them they can't do that? But I couldn't do it. And the most you can do, as you say, Richie, is if you're putting together a selected poems, okay, I leave that out, not because I hate it, but because it no longer persists as even an expression of the younger me. It's just not, artistically up to my current, not even standards, but my current temperament or something. But yes, I definitely feel that the person who wrote my much earlier poems is a quite different person. And you know what it's like? It's like you're going through a drawer or files or something, and you suddenly find a picture of yourself from long ago, and you say, yeah, that was me. And, you know, it's like looking at the poem and saying, I remember being that young. I guess I was that young. And it's the poem that was that young, you know. But yeah, no sense of rejection, just time marches on.
Well, we have a related comment, not a question, but Mandana says, I love this conversation. Thank you both again, especially the way there's a fine line between what is beauty, what is grotesque, altered by our viewpoints, our context, our temporality. We are what changes, not the object, perhaps, which of course I think is always wise. We also
That's
have
really
another
So
question.
eloquent.
So smart, right, Mandana? So good. We have a question from someone I think one, if not both of you might know. This is Anna Ross. This is a long one. I'm going to see if I can fit in here. Hi, Anna.
Hello, Anna.
Our beloved
I'm so glad
Anna
you're
Ross,
here.
who has a book coming out later this year or next summer, I think it is. A new book coming out. Anna says, this is very, very small, so I'll try to do it. One thing I've always loved about Mary Jo's work is her ability to approach contemporary events and experiences such as the Zoom room in a way that expands these experiences beyond the current moment, finding what might be lasting and eternal in them. I see this in Richie's work too, especially in his use of sensory details. I wonder if they can talk about this balance of the contemporary and the eternal moment, if that's not too grandiose a term for it, in their work. Thank you, Anna. That's one of the questions I didn't have time for, so I co-sign that. So the contemporary and the eternal, what do you think?
You know, Anna, that's a wonderful question. And isn't it interesting that I'm just a little bit older than Richie, but I've got, you know, these words like, you know, Zoom rooms and stuff in my book, and you are much more eternal. I mean, you are Rilke-like, and you're talking about stuff. I mean, I don't think you have a cell phone in there. Maybe yes, you have cell phones in a jacket on the floor. You do. But, you know, I feel as the challenge is to write something that sounds like today. And of course, the danger is that if you write about a technology that, you know, the rate that technology is changing, it will look quaint in a matter of a few years. And so all you can hope is that the quaintness is anticipated by the poet. It's not like, I don't know that, but I'm going to set it down the way it is because life, as someone else was saying, you know, that life, we are what changed, not the object. And so, I don't know, Richie, but isn't that interesting? I mean, you are really writing about eternal things a lot of the time.
Well, I was thinking about Phone Call to the Future, which is not so old, but how much, you know, the place of a phone call has changed.
Yes.
In our life. In this, I don't know, there is an element to your poetry that's interested in history of communication and where we are in it. I don't know, I'm always trying to be contemporary. I think I'm doing something and then it doesn't translate or something, or it's something I still want to work on, putting all kinds of language in the poems. It's something your poems teach me, like James Merrill's poems teach me.
But you know, you're very modern in the sense that you are extremely frank about sensory experience, sexual experience, and that is different from poetry of the past. And it's, you know, it's a really important opening, not just for you as a poet, but other people who read you. So that, I mean, modernity isn't just about our gadgets, you know.
Though we spend
Well, I was thinking about that to suggest that our contemporary experience is only objects, I think would probably miss it. I guess that makes me think back to the question about a still life painting too, that there has to be something about a still life that captures the moment in object form, but also suggests something reaching across eras and, you know, the kind of false categories of periodicity, right, of FX, you know, as artificial creations, you know. Okay, well, let's see. I want to make one final call for questions from anyone, but I also just really want to thank you both so much for this conversation. And again, to say happy birthday to Richie. I don't think
Happy
we
birthday, Richie.
Thank you so much. What a perfect party.
Well, let's see. I'm going to see if anyone else has any final questions. But if not, I wanted to ask a final question myself, which is, as I mentioned to you both before we got started, I myself am just really struggling today. And as a teacher of poetry for now 20 years, which is hard to believe, and as you both are teachers of poetry and fans and writers of poetry, etc., I believe it and I believe in it and I know its power and I don't question it. And yet on a day like today, it starts to feel like it's maybe not the first thing I should be doing. And so rather than try to ask you to postulate on the power of poetry or to convince me or anyone otherwise, I wondered if maybe we could talk a little bit about lines or books or poems or even experiences related to poetry that help ground you and sustain you. And I'll just offer one, because this is kind of springing it on you. I'll just offer one myself that I turn to often, which is, I don't have it in front of me, but from a poem by Dean Young, where he talks about, this is from, I believe, faculty summary report in his book, First Course in Turbulence, where he says something about, just try being, actually, it goes back beyond that. When asked how long writers should practice every day, Robert Fripp said, practice 4 hours a day. And when asked how people with lives and families could do that, said, some people can practice 4 hours in 15 minutes, others it takes years. Dean Young himself goes on to say, or his speaker goes on to say, just try being a window and not taking a hammer to yourself. Even a harp has obligations. And those last two lines to me, just try being a window and not taking a hammer to yourself. Even a harp has obligations. I don't know why, unaccountably, and I own that. I find some refuge and purpose in that. Are there lines or poems that occur to you in this way?
I thought about it as you were saying this. It's an obvious one. Yours is really fresh to me. I have not thought about those lines ever before. But one of the things that Auden is always quoted as saying is that poetry makes nothing happen. And Joseph Brodsky, I took a course from him, and he made the point that everyone thinks that's the end of the phrase. And in fact, it's not even the end of the line. Poetry, it goes, poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its saying where executives would never want to tamper. And it survives. Rhyming with executives does the work. I mean, we think of, going to work as being this dead thing, and yet it rhymes with survives. And, I do believe that poetry makes nothing happen. Literally, it doesn't pass gun laws, but it does make something happen inside yourself. And what I wanted in the last couple of days, because of this terrible slaughter of children, is I just wanted a little more outrage. And I think poetry can also express outrage. And it's something, when Richie, when you were talking about, new things I want to do, I don't think I've expressed enough outrage in my poetry. I'm really feeling it. And there has to be a place for that.
Yeah, I was thinking with my students the other day about Frank Bedard's Curse. And I was thinking that's an interesting prompt, to write a poem that is a curse.
Yes.
That we haven't done. Yeah, I think aside from individual consciousness, poetry's also personally been a place to gather and to have friends, many of whom have become really close to me and like family. And now, I was so lucky to have amazing teachers, and now I primarily read the work of my students. That's what I spend most of the time doing. And, it can feel kind of futile. But yesterday I was just feeling terrible about all the ways the world's trying to kill us at all times. And there was just something really that cheered me about being with young people and having a conversation about language and what we value. You're right, Mary Jo. I don't think there's not a policy element. It doesn't take the plastic out of the oceans, but I'm very grateful to have it in my life and for it to be a kind of refuge from the world and a kind of way into the world more deeply and with companions, dead and alive.
Yeah, yeah. That's good.
I love the idea of poetry as being a way for us to see again. Menander's, someone who reads can see things twice, or is something read is twice seen or something. I had a student this semester. I had a great general lit class this semester, which isn't always the case. I had one. We were reading a short story by Kate Chopin, A Pair of Silk Stockings. And, Mrs. Summers in it, gets some money, has a bunch of kids, is criticized maybe even partly by Chopin for going off in the afternoon and spending it all on herself and not, and she ends the story, it's very brief, by going on the trolley back home and just wishing that the trolley would go on forever because now she has to face the music that she spent all this money. And everyone was kind of appropriately, as we'd been guided to do, shaking our heads, saying, well, things were complex, but look at what she was driven to do. And then one student raised his hand and said, I think Mrs. Summers was engaging in self-care. And I thought, you guys can teach me something. I stand to be taught something by this next generation. Yeah, and I felt that it was encouraging. So I'd like to think that just like poetry, younger generations can bring new stuff, including new poets. I can't thank you both enough. Other people are saying the same, how lovely this is. An hour is not enough. Thank you so much. Let's see, we've got a bunch of comments here saying such. And I thought maybe to end us out, Richie, you might be willing to read one another since it's your birthday. And I know Mary Jo and I both want to cheer you.
Sure. And it's nice and short. One another. We are knotted in the white bedding. I don't want sleep to separate us. We breathe with the darkness like an enormous animal. Our bodies manufacture their odors. I taste earth on his skin. Eros enters where shame had lived. Sun, then morning. How easily the earth closes its cavities. I leave the apartment wearing his black anorak.
Thank you both so much. I want to thank Julie, our producer, not only for stepping in despite being sick when my computer failed, but also just for running things behind the scene. I want to thank everybody who's watching and posed questions, and those who have been watching and not posed questions. And sincere thanks to Mary Jo and Richie for visiting us today at Poets in Conversation. Happy birthday again, Richie. It's heartening to see such an earnest friendship and working relationship, but also to hear a little bit behind the curtain about your poems. A reminder to everyone who's interested to check us out at A Mighty Blaze. There are a lot of different programs, from cooking shows to everything related to the written word. So cookbooks, George Saunders, we had an Oscar-winning screenwriter on this week. So there's all sorts of different programs for people who are interested. And of course, I'll be back next month with 2 new poets in conversation. So thanks again to everyone. Have a wonderful spring, and especially thanks to Mary Jo and Richie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.